Hello, welcome to Ahval TV. We have today Alexander Clarkson, and he is a lecturer for German and European Studies at King's College in London. And Alexander is really known with his expertise in diasporas in Europe, across Europe, and definitely the Afrin war impacted on this polarization in Europe. And Alexander today is going to help us understand both the Afrin and also how it reflects in European diasporas.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah.
Let me go first. And you wrote a couple of very important pieces for Ahval in recent weeks, and we will link them in our text. And you were talking about how the Turkey is managing in northern Syria, Jarablus to Al-Bab, and now the operation in Afrin has been going on almost 2 months. First of all, how do you assess the operation? And the second, right after it, how do you think eventuality of Turkish takeover Afrin, what will be the next step for Afrin?
I think that the operation has surprised a lot of people. I think a lot of people at the beginning of the operation, including myself, had a very, perhaps a slightly incorrect opinion about the fighting skills and the efficiency of the YPG, which is the PYD fighting organization, which is of course connected to the Kurdish nationalist PKK. And I think over last couple of years, since the Battle of Kobane, a kind of myth has built around the YPG's fighting abilities, the idea that they are superior to other Syrian militias, either regime or rebel militias, that they are better prepared, that they're better disciplined, that they're better motivated. I think in retrospect, a lot of credit was given to the YPG that should have been given to the US Air Force, in that the YPG's ability to defeat ISIS step by step from Kobane onwards was partly driven by the motivations of many YPG fighters, undoubtedly, and the superior training and organization of some YPG units. But in reality, it was the US Air Force close air support that enabled the YPG to really take piece of land after piece of land with relatively low casualties, although they did take heavy casualties in some places. So the moment they didn't have air support in Afrin, the moment they were actually themselves exposed to air power, this whole myth, I think, has to be questioned, because YPG units seem to have collapsed across large parts of Afrin after 2 to 3 weeks of pressure. And by about the 40th or 50th day of this campaign, and that's about 10 days ago, the YPG largely collapsed. I think to Ankara's surprise. I think Metin Gürcan, wrote a really interesting piece for AL Monitor saying that Ankara is actually planning for a campaign to end in August, right? And actually what we're looking at now is a situation where Afrin city is going to be surrounded relatively quickly. This has boosted morale among the Syrian rebel proxy militias that are effectively now under Turkish control. They feel much happier about what's taking place. They've played a central role. And I think it's boosted morale in the Turkish army and the Jandarma, who are heavily involved in this campaign. So I think the campaign has gone much quicker. It has a destabilizing effect, I think, in that everybody, the regime, the Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, the Turks, the Syrian rebels, are now looking at the YPG and saying, actually, maybe this is not as powerful for us as we thought they are. Maybe we can challenge them elsewhere as well, and they will collapse as quickly as they did here. And it has a secondary destabilizing effect, is because of the speed of the YPG's collapse. Regime militias are now trying to sort of create a buffer zone between the Turks and their rebel proxies in other parts of this zone, like Tel Rifat and Dar Jamal, which means it's quite likely the Turkish army is at least going to try and push them out of at least a few villages there, which leads to much more direct confrontations. So I think coming out of this, I think Ankara will feel emboldened. They feel that they're much more powerful compared to the YPG than everybody thought a few months ago. So Ankara might actually follow through when it's talk about going after places like Manbij, Kamishli, and Hasakah. The Syrian rebel allies feel emboldened. So those networks of formerly rebel militias that are now effectively Turkish proxies, they've seen their alliance with Turkey pay off. The Turks now have reliable allies among the Syrian rebel networks that are, I mean, whether you can call them rebels anymore, whether just full-on Turkish proxies, I think they're drifting to the point where they're basically a part of the Turkish army. And I think Ankara will be emboldened to build a permanent presence in the north. I think this actually, from my point of view, makes this the big difference between Ankara's project and Washington's project. I mean, Washington's project is very jury-rigged, it's very improvisational, it's very ad hoc. That was the Turkish approach at the start of this campaign. But at the end of this campaign, of these 40, 50 days, what you're beginning to see is, I think, a greater confidence in Ankara that they're actually going to stay. And they're actually going to hold on to these territories for the long term, which is North Aleppo, the Euphrates Shield territory. I think they're going to stay in Afrin. And I think clearly what they're also moving to very quickly is to build a force that entrenches Turkey permanently in Idlib province, which is the biggest bit of territory to the south, where we already have Turkish bases now.
So you laid the playground very well. Thank you. This center of Afrin, it might take a little bit longer. I don't know. But it looks like eventually the Turkish forces will take over. So that means that they are going to take over the whole Afrin very soon, maybe in days. What will happen after that? Okay, Turkish forces took over the central Afrin. There are Syrian Arab forces and Turkish forces guarding, patrolling the streets. What is next?
Yeah. I think this is something where a lot of external pressure is necessary, because one of the things that concerns me, and should concern more people who have not taken this Turkish presence seriously enough, and I think that people are beginning to take it seriously now. I think a lot of analysts are now beginning to come to terms with the fact that Turkey is there to stay. But one thing that should concern people is this language of demographic movement, or population movement that we have from Ankara, this language of returning Syrian refugees in Turkey to Afrin, which is not really returning them, because Afrin was always primarily a Kurdish region. This language of throwing people out of Afrin who are a threat to the Turkish state. I think the government in Ankara is in a position now where it has a lot less checks and balances. Remember, the Europeans are very reluctant to put Ankara under too much pressure because of the refugee deals the Europeans have. The setup in Idlib and North Aleppo is perfect for the EU, because that means that refugees can be concentrated under Turkish control in these two provinces in Syria, in a way that means that they don't move on to Turkey and then to the European Union. So I think there's a risk that Ankara falls into a policy of moving people around, possibly forced population expulsion. Certainly, they're creating this corridor from Afrin city to encourage civilians to leave. And the question is, will they let those civilians back, or will they resettle Arab speakers in what was a primarily Kurdish region in order to rebalance the demography? I mean, there are a lot of refugees just south of it, at big refugee camps in Atne. That's the very north of Idlib province. And those people need to be rehoused permanently, because they're not going to go back to East Hama or other parts of Syria, right? So the temptation is there. I think you can already hear that in the language of the AKP, the language of Erdogan himself.
Sure.
The temptation for Ankara is to move these people and settle them permanently in what are abandoned Kurdish villages. So, I mean, that's sort of, not the way democracies basically do counterinsurgency. Democracies are often very reluctant, although they often act ruthlessly, but often very reluctant to get into population expulsion and movement, because that causes all kinds of an impact in terms of domestic politics. But I don't think Ankara has those checks and balances anymore. And I think the United States and Europe, even though Ankara has a lot of leverage towards Europe, the United States and Europe have to step in and say, look, this kind of population expulsion is simply not acceptable in a NATO ally. But I have a bad feeling Ankara might try something along those lines to make Afrin easier to control.
I know it's very early right now, but do you have any expectations that Turkish army forces would leave northern Syria anytime soon?
I don't see the incentives. I think there's three reasons why the Turkish army, actually four, but I mean the three primary reasons why the Turkish army won't leave Syria anytime soon is, the first is the refugee issue. I mean, Ankara, Turkey itself has enormous refugee pressures. Turkey itself doesn't want to have an additional 2.5 million people that would flee from Idlib and other parts of Syria into it if Idlib comes under Syrian army control. I don't think Ankara would want to face that crisis. So simply having these territories under direct control out of Assad's hands enables Ankara to have a space in which it can place refugees, in which it can maybe create an economy, have a reconstruction program under its control that ensures that it doesn't face further refugee waves that would be destabilizing. The second reason for Ankara not to leave is simply that it cannot trust the Assad regime not to rebuild the YPG or encourage the YPG from that territory to destabilize Turkey itself. Remember, this is what the Assad regime used to do with the PKK in the 1980s and 1990s, right? That's one of the reasons Ankara mobilized its army along the border in 1998. I mean, Öcalan lived in Damascus. Ankara has no reason to trust Assad. You know, Assad could just as well set up the YPG in the north and then direct it against Turkey in the near future. And the third reason is simply that it's a project. I mean, the army is a problem still for the AKP. There are a lot of stakeholders in Turkey that need to be kept happy. And this project in the north of Syria is a way of directing the energy of the army outwards, directing the energy of Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, outwards, getting a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of contracts. There's talk of an industrial zone in Al-Bab.
Yeah.
You know, we all know the basic patronage networks used, the construction programs, the budgets, the financing. It's a project that can keep a lot of people happy in Turkey financially.
Yeah.
So I think every pointer is there for for Ankara to stay for a very long time.
Okay. Well, let me get my last question. Your expertise, primary expertise area, the diasporas. We have seen these, fights, clashes in Germany, some airports. This Turkish mosque being burned now. What's happening in this Turkish and Kurdish communities in Europe and particularly in Germany with the Afrin war?
I think, I don't want to sound too cynical, but for the PKK and the PYD, for this network of organizations built around the KCK in Germany, whose ultimate loyalty is ultimately to the ideology of Öcalan, these conflicts have been actually in some ways a way of reviving their fortunes in the Kurdish community. And you can really see this from Kobane onwards. In the 15 years preceding that, from 2000 to 2015, there was still a lot of commitment to the Kurdish national cause, a lot of interest. But many Kurds in Germany have been upwardly socially mobile, so they've gradually seen the emergence of an increasingly strong Kurdish middle class. They're more integrated. Many citizens, actually Kurds tend to become German citizens more than Turks because of their latent loyalty to the Turkish Republic is less. And I think what Kobane has done is it sort of reignited interest, particularly in second generation or third generation Kurds in Germany, in the cause, right? In the cause of nationalism. So whether Afrin survives or falls is in that sense is secondary. I mean, Afrin is a kind of symbol of martyrdom and suffering. And I think the Turkish army needs to keep that in mind as well, is that if they can take the town, but it's also how they take it is as important as if they take it. But Afrin is a symbol of martyrdom and suffering, will increase the divisions, and already is increasing the divisions between Kurds and Turks because of this Kurdish revival since Kobane in the Kurdish diaspora in Europe. And the fact that also parts of the Turkish community, and the interesting thing about the Afrin campaign is there are a lot of people in the Turkish diaspora who are very well integrated, who do not like Erdogan at all, don't like AKP, who voted no in the referendum, support the Afrin campaign. Right?
Oh.
So if Erdogan has found one thing, and this is actually where the diaspora does find similarities with what's happening in Turkey itself, is the one thing that unites a lot of people who do not like Erdogan with AKP supporters in Germany is the fact that the Afrin campaign is seen as a necessary, possibly a necessary evil. So this is one case where, there are large parts of the Turkish community that are left-wing, that have, and actually the Turkish left is more successful in the diaspora than it is in Turkey, because so many people fled in 1980. So there's a strong set of networks in the Turkish diaspora in Germany that are strongly left-leaning. But the Turkish left in Germany is actually quite divided over this. Some still show support to the PKK or support to those fighting for Afrin. But I think a large proportion of people who otherwise don't like the current Turkish government are actually unwilling to go out in the streets against this campaign because they simply cannot bring themselves to support the PKK or support PKK organizations. So whereas actually Afrin is a kind of a demobilizing factor in the Turkish community. It's divided, people aren't sure how to react to it. Many people support the Turkish government but are also embarrassed because of their support, because they know that German society as a whole doesn't like what's happening in Turkey or Afrin. In the Kurdish community, it's made it much more unified than may have been 4 or 5 years ago. Not just Afrin, but Afrin is one part of this. But since Kobane, the emergence of the YPG as this force, this mobilizing force, has revived the fortunes of the PKK and its organizations in Germany in a way that I wouldn't have predicted around 2011. Around 2011, most members of the Kurdish diaspora were increasingly disengaged from Turkish and Kurdish politics. And it looks so much different now. I mean, there's writing that things that I wrote 4 or 5 years ago that I regret writing now because I was predicting, because of this social integration of Kurds in German society, which is much more advanced than I think a lot of people understand. I really thought diaspora politics was going to become less important. But what Kobane has done, and the suffering has done, and the revival of the war has done, is revived this interest in a new generation in Germany, which, you know, I think means that these divisions in the diasporas and between the diasporas will continue for some time yet.
Okay, this was a fascinating conversation. I think we are going to hopefully continue talking both the diasporas as well as what will happen in Afrin in coming months. I hope to have you again here, Alexander. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much. Thank you.